This last section of Japanese expansionism covers the route to Pearl Harbor. The key question is, what Japanese actions led to war with the United States? Japan's army was the main protagonist in the Second Sino-Japanese War. Although Japan had not completed its victory against China, ultranationalists in Japan's government and military wanted to further increase the size of the empire at the expense of the recently defeated European states. This would help Japan in China as it sought ways to cut all supplies to Chongqing, the base of Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist forces. These actions eventually provoked the USA to respond, leading directly to the outbreak of the Second World War in Asia. Although Japan occupied China's ports, supplies continued to reach China's government at Chongqing. While some supplies were sent by the Soviets, the US, and Great Britain through Burma and China's far western provinces, the largest supplies came through French Indochina, specifically Laos and Cambodia. With France's defeat by Germany in 1940, its colonies were vulnerable. Japan requested permission from the French governor of Indochina to occupy its northern regions so as to cut supply lines to China. In exchange, Japan would allow the French government, now ruled by Vichy France, to remain in Indochina. This threat was clearly understood and permission was granted. Japan landed troops in French Indochina in September 1940 and soon built air bases. This is an excerpt from David Liu's book. David Liu is a former professor of East Asian Studies at Bucknell University, and he wrote in 1961, prior to the outbreak of war in Europe, Japan entertained no territorial designs towards French Indochina. Its objectives were to gain French recognition of the state of war in China and of Japan's belligerent rights. Back in 1938, Japan repeatedly asked the French Indo-Chinese authorities to halt shipment of war materials to Chiang Kai-shek and had received no satisfaction. The War, Navy, and Foreign Ministries of Japan advanced the idea of bombing the Yunnan Railroad, which was built by the French, forcing a diplomatic settlement. But no concrete action was taken until the fall of 1939. So, of course, David Liu is a revisionist historian, and you can see where he's going back and saying, wait, traditional historians, you are blaming fully Japan. And most sources do actually blame Japan for dragging the US into the war. But he's arguing that actually the invasion of Indochina, which led to war with the United States, was provoked by the French. So a very fascinating, different perspective than what we're actually learning. The U.S. response was almost immediate. 3 days after Japan's action, the U.S. prohibited the sale of scrap iron and steel to Japan. The U.S. was one of the main suppliers of metals to Japan for its industries. The U.S. also increased its financial assistance to China's government, but supply lines were difficult to maintain because of increasing Japanese pressure. In July 1941, Japan occupied the rest of French Indochina. The U.S. immediately responded by freezing all Japanese assets in the United States and its territories, including bank deposits, stocks, bonds, ships, and purchases that were waiting for shipment to Japan. They banned the sale of oil to Japan, and they granted $240 million to China's government for military purposes. Great Britain followed the USA and froze all Japanese assets throughout Britain and its empire. As the Netherlands ruled its colonial empire from London, since its own country had been overrun by German armies in 1940, it also froze Japan's assets in its territories. Both countries hoped that their response would warn Japan away from aggressive actions towards their possessions. The ban on oil sales had the greatest effect on Japan and its policies. The USA was the largest supplier of oil to Japan, and without oil and its byproducts, such as fuel for ships, aircraft, and tanks, Japan's war against China would necessarily collapse. Japan had stored approximately 18 months' worth of fuel. This meant that in 18 months, Japan had to have another source of oil, or their armies and industries would simply collapse. The largest nearby source of oil was the Netherlands Dutch East Indies, or Indonesia. Japan made plans for its occupation. Japan's government assumed that the US would be provoked into war by a move to the Dutch East Indies, especially since the Philippines, a US colony, lay vulnerably between Japan and the Indies. Japan's Admiral Yamamoto developed a plan to attack the United States by defeating the US Navy's Pacific Fleet based at Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto hoped that the US government would be so surprised by Japan's action that it would choose not to fight Japan, allowing Japan time to absorb the Dutch East Indies into its growing empire and cut all supply lines to China. If the US chose to fight, however, the loss of its navy would mean that it would take at least a year or probably longer for the United States to actually put any military stress on Japan. This would still give Japan plenty of time to defeat China, annex the Dutch East Indies, and organize itself for war with the United States. Another factor in Japan's planning for war with the United States was its support for the Soviet Union in its war against Germany. Japan's government was still primarily concerned about the military threat posed by the Soviet Union and the spread of communism. When Germany began an invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, the US responded with $1 billion of aid. Oil, food, trucks, tanks, ammunition, money, and other goods were shipped from the United States to Soviet ports on the Pacific. In April, the Soviet Union and Japan had signed a neutrality pact preventing Japan from interfering with these shipments. Japan signed the pact so that it could finish its war against China and move against the Soviet Union at some later date. It did not want to have to fight a war with China and the Soviet Union simultaneously. US aid to the Soviets had the potential to save them from Germany's armies, and Japan wanted the Soviets defeated, just not by their armies at this point. The United States increased pressure on Japan on the 26th of November, 1941. In the Hull Note, named after U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, the U.S. demanded that Japan remove all its troops from Indochina and China, including Manchuria, end its participation in the Tripartite Alliance, and repudiate the Republic of China that Japan had created, headed by Wang Jue. 2 weeks later, Japan attacked U.S. and British forces all across the Pacific Ocean region. On December 7th or December 8th in Asia, a large-scale and highly organized series of attacks and invasions was launched by Japan against many targets. The most important of these was the attack on Pearl Harbor, the main U.S. naval base in the U.S. territory of Hawaii. A large Imperial Japanese Navy fleet moved across the Pacific Ocean undetected by the United States in early December 1941. On the 7th of December, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers launched 353 aircraft of several types in 2 waves. These attacked U.S. Navy ships, airfields, aircraft, and other facilities with torpedoes, bombs, and machine gun fire. The attack on the U.S. fleet did the following. It damaged 4 battleships and sank 4 others. It severely damaged or sank 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 2 other naval vessels. It destroyed 188 aircraft, and it killed over 2,400 people and injured 1,200 others. Japan's losses were minimal. 20 aircraft were destroyed, 5 small submarines sunk, and 65 men killed. While Japan clearly won the battle, one of their main objectives remained unmet: to destroy all 3 U.S. aircraft carriers. These were not present at Pearl Harbor as they were in a training exercise elsewhere. Oil and torpedo storage facilities also survived the attack. The USA declared war on Japan the next day. This would eventually lead to Japan's defeat and surrender in August 1945. This is an excerpt from James Huffman, published by Oxford University Press in 2004. Huffman is a professor of East Asian history at Wittenberg University in the United States. He has authored many works on modern Japanese history. The following is an excerpt from the Declaration of War on the United States and Britain by Japan by Emperor Hirohito. We, the Showa Emperor Hirohito, hereby declare war on the United States of America and the British Empire. The men and officers of our Army and Navy shall do their utmost in prosecuting the war. Our public servants of various departments shall perform faithfully and diligently their appointed tasks, and all other subjects of ours shall pursue their respective duties. The entire nation with a united will shall mobilize their total strength so that nothing will miscarry in the attainment of our war aims. While Pearl Harbor was under massive attack, Japan moved against other U.S.-held territories. Japan attacked the Philippines by air on December 8th, and soon thousands of Japanese troops were landed to begin a large-scale invasion of the islands. The island of Guam was a major junction point of undersea cables linking the U.S. and the Philippines, as well as other parts of Asia. It, too, was attacked on December 8th by aircraft, with Japanese forces landing within days to take control of the island. Wake Island held a U.S. air base. Japan attacked it by air on December 8th. The island was conquered in several weeks, giving Japan airfields that allowed it to control a large section of the Pacific Ocean. As Pearl Harbor, Guam, and Wake Island were under assault, Japan launched attacks against British territories in Asia. Japanese troops invaded Malaysia on December 8th, and Japanese aircraft attacked British naval vessels in the area. All of Malay and Singapore were captured by mid-February 1942. Japan also attacked Britain's great port in China, Hong Kong, on December 8th and conquered it by the end of December. Burma, a major British territory that also produced oil, was placed under immediate pressure when Thailand, an independent state, was invaded on December 8th from French Indochina. Thailand immediately surrendered, and soon Burma was invaded by forces from Thailand and Japan, now allied. As you can see, we have two different interpretations here of Japanese expansionism. So we have one historian, he is Japanese, and he argues that the attack was caused by the oil embargo, which forced Japan into war. So you can almost see this as like what we call apologetic history. Whereas revisionist historians go even further and suggest that FDR deliberately provoked Japan into making an attack so he could join World War II. So, we have different theories on why this happened. Of course, the traditional one, again, always blames Japan. In summary of Japan's expansion and the international response, basically Japan's chaotic and weak political system allowed the army to interfere with the state's foreign policy and ultimately dictate it. This led to the Manchurian crisis, which was mainly caused by Japanese troops anxious to annex the Chinese province of Manchuria. While successfully invading Manchuria, the military increased control of the government in Japan and its economy. Pretending to liberate Manchurian people from China's rule through the creation of the puppet state of Manchukuo did not convince the League of Nations that Japan only acted in the best interest of those it conquered. A slow-moving league eventually criticized Japan in the Lipton Report in 1932, but could do no more. As Japan's military took more control of the economy, it occupied more territories in China. In 1937, China and Japan entered a new phase as Japan launched a massive two-prong invasion of its neighbor. This, the Second Sino-Japanese War, would see Japan conquer much of eastern China, the death of millions of Chinese through starvation and war, and the establishment of another Japanese puppet state, the Republic of China. Japan was unable to end resistance to its rule or conquer Western China, leading to attempts to cut off supply routes to the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek in Chongqing. Japan invaded French Indochina and eventually controlled most of it, leading the U.S. to place an embargo on important industrial materials that Japan desperately required. Japan decided that the best course of action was to annex even more territory so that it would have an oil-producing region, the Dutch East Indies. Japan executed an attack on the main U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in 1941, hoping to shock the U.S. into allowing the annexation of the Dutch East Indies, or at least delay the U.S. response. Instead, the U.S. declared war on Japan, eventually leading to the destruction of Japan's empire in the Second World War in the Pacific. And that's it for Japanese expansionism.